This is Dead Air, with a story about a ship crewed by the living and the dead. This happened 15 years ago when I was 19. At the time, I worked on cargo vessels, and this was my third trip to sea. The ship was around 30 years old when I was on board, which doesn't sound old, but it's pretty old for a ship. The vessel had been refitted a few times by the time I was on board. For anyone who works in a similar job, you will know what it's like being the young, relatively new guy on an all-male team with people who've lived and worked together for months or years. In essence, you feel like an outsider and have to prove your worth. And also you can expect to have a load of practical jokes played on you. So you can imagine when I joined this ship and the guys were all talking about a ghost on board, I was like, yeah, whatever. They asked me if I believed in ghosts, and I said no, which was actually a lie, as I had experienced things before. Anyway, they just said something like, you will soon. And I just laughed it off. I think I'd been on board for about a week when I first heard a loud knock at the cabin door. I had my own cabin, but it was a small one in the middle of the accommodation with no porthole. I opened the door, and there was no one there. I definitely thought I was getting pranked. This started happening regularly, and it would be at all sorts of times, often waking me while I was sleeping with 3 loud knocks. Every time I tried to jump up and open the door as quickly as possible to catch the person, I never saw anyone or even heard them running away. Now my cabin was roughly in the middle of a corridor. I'd say it was around 20 meters long, so you'd have to run 10 meters to get around a corner. A few times I felt like I'd opened the door quick enough that I should have seen them. This got me thinking maybe it was someone in a neighboring cabin. I asked who was in the cabins next to mine. There was an old guy in one cabin who was in his 60s, and I'd never seen him move fast enough. The others were empty. This is quite common on older ships, as they used to get built to house more crew, but ships sail with less and less crew these days. The knocking continued until one day I was at my wardrobe, hanging my shirt up literally next to the cabin door, when there was a knock. I opened it so fast I should have been face to face with them. The corridor was empty. That's when I realized there was something else going on. After that, I started taking more notice of what other people were saying, and I also started paying attention to the oppressive feeling on board. I had been on 2 ships previously, and I sailed on 4 more after this one, and none had an atmosphere like that. Things got worse after that. One of my jobs at night would be making rounds of the ship to check that the cargo is secured and there are no problems. You take a radio with you so you can radio the bridge if you need to. The radio would sometimes loudly blast static for no reason, and if I radioed the officer on the bridge to ask if they said something, they would come back clear and say, nope, and there was no static for them. This happened with multiple radios, so it wasn't just one dude item. One day on my rounds, I was in the laundry at 2 a.m. making checks, and an alarm sounded. I spun around to see the watertight door closing behind me. I radio the bridge and ask if they are closing it, which would be unusual as they only get operated in tests and emergencies. The second mate said no, and on his console it's showing open. The door closed all the way, and the second mate radioed to tell me to try to manually override, as he can't do it from the bridge, as the console still says the door is open. I used the lever to override and open the door. I radioed to tell the mate, and he says he'll get it looked at by the engineers. I carry on with my rounds, and as I approach the next door, the alarm sounds and it starts closing. I radio the mate and he says he's not doing anything and I'll have to override again. This time I get it open, and as soon as it's fully open, it starts to close again. I look around and the other door is also now closing. At this point, I'm getting shut into the laundry. I get a feeling of impending doom. That's when the lights begin to flicker and static blasts over the radio. I jumped through the closing door, really bad idea because they can crush you, and noped the fuck out of there. Now theoretically that could be a coincidence of failing systems or someone playing tricks. The doors can be controlled from the bridge, but it's just not something someone would do as a prank, since they can kill you. Also, when the door started closing, no one would have known I was there. It was just me and the mate and an engineer awake at that time, and there were no cameras. They did a full watertight door test the next day and found no faults. I should mention that watertight doors are each controlled by an independent system, so if one fails, they don't all fail, meaning two doors experiencing faults together would be unlikely to say the least. After that, I never went in the laundry alone again. One night I did my late night rounds as usual and reported back up to the bridge when I finished. When I got there, the second mate was white as a sheet and shaking. He was holding a cup of tea that was sloshing about from how much his hand was shaking. I asked if he was okay, and he could barely speak. Finally, he managed to tell me that he was sat in front of the radar screen 5 minutes earlier. When he heard me come back to the bridge, he asked if everything was okay, and I didn't respond. He looked over his shoulder back at me, but instead it was an old guy, pale and wide-eyed, staring down at him from just an arm's length away. He literally fell off his chair, and the old guy disappeared in front of his eyes. He said the worst thing was the expression of malice on the face of the old guy. The second mate was weeping as he told me this, and he was a pretty tough guy. The worst experience was in my cabin. I'd been on board maybe 3 months by this point, and had kind of accepted that I was stuck on this messed up ship. I guess some of the fear had gone as you get used to being on edge. I ignored my door knocking by this point. It might have even stopped happening, I don't recall. Anyway, I get into bed one night, read for a bit, and turn the light off. As soon as I turn the light off, I think I see a figure standing over the bed, but it's pretty much pitch black, so I can't make out any detail. And after initially jumping, I reprimand myself for being silly and assume it's just my eyes adjusting. Then the figure sits down on the bed, squashing my legs and turning its head towards me. I can literally hear you screaming sleep paralysis at me right now, but I have experienced sleep paralysis and can tell you it wasn't that. I could move my arms and upper body just fine, and I could move my feet, but my lower legs were trapped by the weight of something. I was frantically pulling the duvet to try and dislodge the thing and get my legs out, but it was impossible. I tried to reach for the light switch, but it was a couple of inches out of reach. I started full on swinging at the space where it should be sat, but my hands didn't hit anything. I started screaming, "Fuck off, fuck off," excuse the language, over and over, and eventually the figure stood up and I could move my legs. I hit the light and there was nothing there. I couldn't sleep without copious amounts of alcohol and a nightlight after that, even for a bit after I left the ship, which, as you can imagine, was awesome for picking up girls in my early 20s. "Hey, wanna come round and stay over? Excuse me while I get shit-faced and turn my nightlight on." A couple of weeks before I got off the ship, I knew I was leaving by this point, so my mood had greatly improved. I was working in the electrical store, which was brightly lit with my back to the door. I heard someone come in, and I saw the shadow of someone on the bulkhead as they walked along the shelves behind me. I said, "Hello," and got no answer. Turned around and no one was there. I think by virtue of the combined facts that it was a well-lit room, I was getting off soon, and I had perfected my coping mechanism of liquidating brain cells and giving myself liver damage on a nightly basis. This final encounter simply didn't bother me overly much. As I remember, I just turned around and carried on. Other crew members had stories too. Since these are not my encounters, I can't vouch for the validity of these, so feel free to take them with however many pinches of salt as you deem appropriate. But that said, I had no reason to disbelieve the people who told them to me, especially considering my own experiences on that ship. Story 1. The chef was the kind of guy you'd probably imagine being a cook on a ship. Overweight, a little greasy, and a bit of a joker with a dark sense of humor. He relentlessly mocked anyone who claimed to have seen the ghost. That was until he opened the stainless steel fridge one day, and in the mirror-like reflection at the back of it, he saw the face of an old man leaning in over his shoulder. I believe he used the word leering. I was inclined to believe him since his demeanor totally changed. He wasn't very jolly for the rest of the time we sailed together. Or 2. A middle-aged seaman was doing the rounds one night, checking everything was okay. He saw a figure down aft at the back of the ship, leaning over the railings looking out to sea. He called out, thinking it was a crewman who wasn't able to sleep, and the figure turned around. The seaman shone his torch over at the figure, but the torch does not illuminate it, like the figure is made of darkness. The figure walked behind a large winch on deck, and the seaman followed. There was nobody there, and nowhere a person could have gone without being seen. Story 3. The purser, finance and stores officer, usually pretty respected and level-headed, went down to do his laundry and saw a figure with its back turned as he went through the door. The figure turned to face him, and it's an older man he's never seen before, apparently, with a sinister expression. The figure moved towards him, and he ran out of there. I'm afraid I don't remember exactly how he described the appearance of the figure, but suffice to say it was apparent that it was not a living person, or he would have challenged them. Story 4. One night, while a seaman was doing rounds at night, he went down some stairs to the cargo hold and ended up falling down them. Luckily, he wore a hard hat because he hit his head on the bulkhead at the bottom. He was beat up pretty good and fractured some ribs, if I recall correctly. The scary thing was, he later said he felt like he was pushed. After the second mate's story of seeing the ghost on the bridge one night in my last post, I witnessed his terror firsthand, which left no doubt in my mind that his encounter was truthful. I heard from a few crewmen that the captain had seen the ghost numerous times, but I never asked him myself. Captains tend to be stern fellows who radiate an aura which says, "Don't bother me unless it's important," and I didn't want to look stupid if it was just crewmates on a wind-up. I also heard there was a cabin they kept locked and never used, because the activity was greater in there. That was when I first joined the ship and I thought they were pulling my leg. Once I had experienced things myself, I never felt inclined to ask any more about that cabin, so I'm still not sure if there was any truth to it. The last big thing had multiple witnesses, so when I'd been in that ship about 5 months, me and the night watch were in the crew bar after our watch finished, probably at 4 a.m. I was about to begin my routine of getting so drunk I'd pass out and not care if a ghost sat on me or whatever. We were talking about some of the weird shit we had seen on board. It was me, the second mate, the second engineer, and a grease monkey, engineer lackey. As we were talking, one of the guys looks across the bar and says, "What the fuck?" His mouth is open in like an O. We all look where he's looking, and a Henry Hoover is floating about 2 feet off the floor with its stupid smiley face looking at us. The second mate says "fuck off" in an incredulous manner, and the Hoover gets thrown a few feet off to the left instead of just getting dropped. I think it was just one entity on the ship, though I really couldn't say. Multiple people claimed to clearly see the face, and they all said it was an older male. I never saw it clearly, though. My theory is that maybe these entities feed off of fear somehow. That's just from my own experiences. And yeah, it freaked me out so bad. It was one of the reasons I stopped working on ships. I'm also still scared of being alone in the dark, if I'm honest, though I no longer need to drink myself into a stupor or have a light on to sleep. It definitely changed me because when I was a child, I was never afraid of the dark. I googled the ship and it has since been scrapped.
You've been listening to Dead Air. Like and subscribe for more. Good night.